He has worked in a large variety of roles, such as in the OECD, SARI, as a professor at Ghent University, as a counselor to different ministers of education, as a chief of staff also for former minister. He's a well-known figure in education policy and research in Flanders and abroad, whose insights have influenced educational landscapes internationally. And today, Dirk is an independent consultant and senior research fellow at the Center for Curriculum Design in Boston, remaining at the forefront of educational paradigms. So please join me in welcoming Dirk van Damme.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. Very happy to be here. Good morning, everyone. Before I start, and I have to give you a bit of advance warning, this will be a very critical speech, but I want to extend my credentials with regard to evidence-informed education. Of course, I'm a big believer in evidence, in good research, in the capacity of the education system and the need of the education system to absorb many more examples of excellent research, etc. So please accept that from the beginning, because the rest will be a bit more critical and inducing a bit of doubt. Where do I speak from? And Jeroen has already mentioned a bit of my professional bio. I think the advantage of my experience is that I have been at both sides. I have been at the side of research production as a professor of educational research at Ghent University, leading, supervising, coaching lots of young researchers. But I have also been in the policy domain for many years, and I have been always speaking to teachers, to school leaders. I appreciate very much the kind of feedback that I hear from them, and also that is integrated in my talk today. As I said, I'm a big believer in evidence-informed education, but I have seen so many mistakes, so many misunderstandings, so many missed opportunities to learn from each other. And the blame, if that word is correct, is on both sides. So it is really something where we can do a lot better. So I'm actually rather a skeptic than a missionary. I have difficulties in preaching the good word that evidence-informed education is all we need, because I'm more skeptical. But I'm not an epistemological relativist. I don't think that any kind of knowledge is in itself good. Of course, research knowledge has a lot of merits and is closer to the truth than other systems of knowledge. So what is evidence-informed education? I think we have to start from the understanding of professionalism. Education is a professional activity. Decisions are taken by professionals. And these decisions are taken not in a knowledge-poor environment, as some people sometimes think, but in a knowledge-rich environment. This knowledge environment is very complex, with conflicting sources of knowledge. I will go deeper into that. And it's very complicated. So teachers, as professionals, have an extremely difficult job, because they have to make difficult decisions in a high level of insecurity, with conflicting sources of information. I think that understanding is really crucial. So the purpose and the mission of evidence-informed education is to maximize that knowledge source, which is firmly grounded in good research, in evidence, in order to improve education outcomes. That would be my tentative definition. Of course, and that information comes from data. We have seen the data environment improving in many systems in Europe, and that's an excellent thing. It comes also from research evidence, and I will focus more on the research evidence than on the data in my talk. So education has improved in being an evidence-informed system. There is no doubt about that. Supply of high-quality educational research has been growing. Most European systems, as I said, have extensive data systems. There is more sensitivity and more demand among policymakers, stakeholders, practitioners, teachers, schools for good evidence compared to, say, 20, 30 years ago. Ministries have improved their knowledge capacity. Brokerage institutions have seen the light, and we have now a couple of excellent ones in Europe, including here a new one in Flanders, Leerpunt, but also in the Netherlands and many other countries, and I'm sure that a large part of the audience comes from that community. But the promises of evidence-informed education are not materializing. I think that's a rather bitter fact. Compared with the health sector, we are still not there. The gap is enormous, and you can calculate the gap in different ways, and the OECD, we have tried to give good estimates of that. Maybe the most dramatic way to illustrate that is that the health sector has 26 times more good research synthesis papers than the education sector. And you can give many other indicators. But more importantly, if the idea of evidence-informed education is to improve education, to improve outcomes, we have not seen anything. Indeed, education is in a worse state. We've seen a dramatic decline in learning outcomes, as is evident from PISA and many other large-scale assessments. Equity is not improving. Per student cost of education is rising. I would even say exploding. So nor in learning outcomes, nor in equity, nor in efficiency of public spending, there is improvement, despite the fact that the evidence has flown more intensively to the education sector and the education system. I'm not suggesting any causality here. I just say that the promise to improve education by introducing more evidence is not materializing. And I think we have to take that very seriously. What went wrong? There is still the dominant view, which I would call the simple linear model of the action theory, of the theory of action of evidence-informed education. So research production, the results are mediated and then are integrated into use by practitioners and policymakers, and that leads to improved outcomes. So a unidirectional, very linear model of thinking, which is still dominant in this field. And if we look at why the situation is not improving in education, most people would say, I think, I'm afraid, well, we need to do the mediation phase better. We need to improve translation of research. We need to improve the brokerage institutions that play a very important part. And I actually don't disagree with that. But in my view, the mediation part is the least of the problem. I think what happens there is quite excellent. And of course, you can always improve things, but that's not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is in research production and research use. And that's often left out of the picture when the importance of evidence-informed education is discussed. When I looked at the program of the conference yesterday and today, it is focusing on mediation. It's not enough focusing on, do we produce the right research? And how is the research evidence used by practitioners and policymakers? And you can list a lot of challenges in this rather naive linear model. I will not read them because I will go into depth in several of them. Let me start with research production. I'm quite, and some people say you are too critical of your own profession and your own field. I am not convinced that we are doing a good job in education research. There are huge improvements in research methodologies, and I'm so glad to see that young researchers are now much more methodological savvy than I was when I graduated. So there has been a lot of improvement in research methodologies, but there are so many quality issues still with education research. I'll just name a few of them, but there are many more than I have listed here. The replication crisis is a very serious issue. Please don't underestimate the seriousness of the replication issues. Only a very, very, very small part of research findings stands after replication in different countries, different environments. The replication crisis has caused a lot of discussion in psychology, not enough in the education sciences, but it needs to be taken seriously. There are thousands of examples of biases in research, of the importance of ideology, of groupthink, even of fraud. Once in a while you see cases of outright fraud popping up, which is not acceptable. The research community is not self-critical enough. Other problems, the effect sizes of a lot of research are exaggerated. There have been a couple of really excellent papers published on how effect sizes, even in randomized controlled trials, are exaggerated. Prolific publication trends leading towards the canonization of well-established findings rather than advancing the body of knowledge. Not enough reviews, not enough meta-reviews. We are doing very poor in meta-analysis in educational research. And very few attempts at moving from empirical findings to conceptualization and more theoretical developments. And there are several more. So education research is not building, as we see in many other fields, like biomedical research, for example, a cumulative body of knowledge. Findings are not consistent over time, cannot be replicated, depend too much on fashionable trends and ideologies. And there are so many examples. And that's why myth-busting is such a popular activity in the education sector, because it is needed. A famous example is, of course, learning styles. Learning styles, which was, when I was a student, this was propagated as a very important new theory, has been completely falsified, but it has found its way into policy and practice. It's still believed by many teachers because they heard it so many times. It's still believed by many teachers, but it's rubbish. And there are many other examples. I would personally say growth mindset, the same thing. Growth mindset is not robust when you do a replication, when you do really serious research analysis, but it's a very popular term. And it's a nice term, it's a nice concept, and many people like to believe growth mindset. And there are some interesting aspects in the concept. I also am in favor of high expectations and positive reinforcement culture around learning, etc., etc. But the concept of growth mindset is, from a research point of view, is, in my view, rubbish. Social constructivism. We have been, I think everyone in this room, believers in social constructivism for many years. I now am truly convinced that it is a theory which is such a shame. It is very influential. It is very influential in policy papers, in what teachers believe. It has driven reforms in the 1990s and the years 2000. It has been very influential, but it's built on very shaky scientific foundations and more on ideology than sound research. And it caused a lot of harm. and is probably partly responsible for the decline in quality. For me, if you would ask me, name one element to explain the PISA decline, I would say social constructivism. As a theory, as a concept, as a policy. And yeah, I can name many other mistakes, and we have to take responsibility. I think also as a professor and as someone with its feet in educational research, I believe that we have to take huge responsibility for that. Just a couple of illustrations. This is a very famous article it's already a bit outdated. Hopefully the figure has improved, but only 0.13% of education papers were replications, which is the lowest if you compare with all social sciences. Biases, very widespread. A very interesting research from Johns Hopkins University a couple of years ago, when a researcher was responsible for introducing a reform and also for evaluating the effects of that reform. The results were much more positive than when an independent external reviewer did the evaluation. So insider bias, and this is happening all the time. We always give research evaluation in the same hands as those who have been important or influential in introducing and executing the intervention. I will now focus a little bit on in my view, rather, because what I've said so far about educational research are maybe more at the surface, but I would like to go a little bit in depth into what I see as the issue of proof in educational research. I think RCTs are becoming more popular. There are much more excellent RCTs being published, although it still is very difficult to do, even especially in research going into the heart of the teaching and learning process, because experimentation with children is ethically very difficult to do. So researchers need to work with less powerful methodologies, often cross-sectional studies, surveys, and then, of course, it is very difficult to make causal inferences on the findings. Longitudinal studies are still exceptional compared with the medical sector, for example. Qualitative research is very popular in education research, and I'm not someone who will say qualitative research is inferior. I think there is excellent qualitative research, but the methodological requirements are very strict, and you have to do it right. But there is a resistance, an ideological resistance, a political resistance against quantitative research in the field of educational research. I think everyone recognizes that. So the consequence of this landscape is that hard proof in educational research is very rare. And I'm going to illustrate that with, maybe you have seen this the pyramid of proof, where the higher you go into the levels, the more robust the proof becomes. So the quality of evidence is improving as you go higher and higher up in the pyramid. But I would say that the majority of educational research is still situated here. And we can do a lot better. We should do a lot better. We have to strengthen the level of proof in educational research. I will come back to the layers here of professional knowledge, because that's, in my view, a very important part of the landscape, but that's for the second half of my talk. What I want to say here is that the higher you go into this pyramid, the stronger your evidence becomes and the narrower the contribution to the body of knowledge. So that's called the epistemic uncertainty. An RCT can be very powerful, but it explains only a very small part of reality. So the advantage of professional knowledge is that it explains more, that it's more actionable because it explains more of reality than a randomized controlled trial. And that's a trade-off which is very difficult to solve. But it's a very real problem. I could go into more depth on this topic. I think I need to stop here. Education research has not yet a good track record. I'm probably a bit tough on this, but I don't think that we can say as education research producers that we have enough evidence to support the education system in all its knowledge needs. That's simply not the case. So we need more and better education research. Don't convince me of that. I think we need long-term investments in strong educational knowledge. We need much more powerful peer review, because that's another topic that I didn't address, but peer review is extremely weak in our sector. Because we all are engaged in networks, in friendships, etc., etc. That's another topic. But we need more robust educational research. We need a stronger knowledge infrastructure. We need long-time programmatic planning. And we need more better educational approaches while accepting methodological pluralism. So that's a huge program. That's not easy to solve and to implement, but it's desperately needed. We need a realistic and fair approach to the problem of the level of truth. I've seen so many cases where researchers come to speak with ministers, and because they want to be interesting to the minister, they want to convince the minister of their research, and they draw unwarranted conclusions, misleading even ministers. And when ministers ask critical questions, they say, yeah, but we didn't research that. We need more research for your question to be answered. So I'm coming back to that as well. The communication is not ideal, not good. We have to accept that research evidence cannot possibly fill the entire knowledge space in education. And as researchers, we should be honest. We should always present our findings as situational specific. I become more and more critical about the phrase, what works. That's misleading. We should say what works in specific conditions. So we have to be more honest, more humble, but we should improve, of course, our education research. And evaluation of research is so rare in our field. We need tougher evaluations. We need to be confronted with the best possible practice in educational research. Our field is not ready for really serious evaluations. Okay, so I have been quite tough and critical on the production side. I'm more optimistic and positive on the mediation side, but there are a couple of issues that I want to mention here. It is extremely difficult, and I really admire people who are working in brokerage institutions, and there are a couple of excellent ones, to translate, whatever word you prefer, research findings into comprehensible, usable knowledge. That's very difficult to do. The problem is, one hand, information overload, a problem of selection, but also risk of over-interpretation, neglecting the level of uncertainty in research. I think it's excellent practice that EEF is mentioning the strength of the evidence in its toolkit. That's something that we always should do. We should always make clear when we communicate research findings how strong the evidence is based on the methodological merits of the research. And we should, resist the temptation to be more conclusive than the evidence allows. I sometimes see messages coming out of brokerage institutions which I think are over-conclusive by suggesting causality where there is no causality allowed, where transferability of research findings is suggested where it should not be suggested, etc., etc. But I recognize the difficulty. It is very, very difficult to translate research findings into actionable knowledge, both to practitioners and to policymakers. A very interesting article in Education Week, and you know the American journal, 2 weeks ago, I think, where they discussed 5 mistakes for educators to avoid. And it's quite a critical article. And I just selected one paragraph, and they conclude, well, it's understandable that teachers and school leaders get frustrated when studies and clearinghouses seem to come to different conclusions about a given program or intervention. So I cannot say that despite the investments in mediation, that the field of users is already convinced and happy with the outcomes. That's maybe too early. That's not yet the case. I think the mistake is by seeing production, mediation, use as a linear process. I think that has been discussed already in other talks in this conference. It should be seen as a relational process, as somewhere where you have to build trust, where you have to build expertise, interaction, collaboration. But it is still a very difficult activity. So I really admire people who are working in this field. But information management, skill development, research skill development, capacity building seem to be the serious challenges in this part of the game. But let me turn to the research use side, because I think there the more serious problems are to be situated there. The idea that I sometimes see in discussions about evidence-informed or evidence-based education is that you have good research, you have to fill the empty bucket of the user side. It reminds me a little bit of the book that I loved when I was a student, Paulo Freire, who said, well, education is still perceived as filling the empty head of the learner. And the same is true here. Research evidence does not enter an empty space. It has to conquer its place against alternative systems of knowledge. And I want to develop that idea a little bit further. And I will do it first for education policy and then for educational practice. And I draw here on my experience as someone who has been active for many years in the policy field, working even with ministers who had PhDs, who were excellent researchers themselves, but who got extremely nervous when they had to discuss things with educational researchers. And I have always witnessed that game and that tension, and I wondered what is happening here? Why are they becoming so nervous of each other? Because the good thing is, of course, that policies of modern welfare states are becoming more knowledge intensive. That's certainly a very important trend. Knowledge becomes an important tool of policy development. And that raises even sometimes questions about democratic legitimacy of technocrats. But knowledge doesn't seem to find its way easily in policy development. And there are many reasons for that. There are of course, many belief systems, including political ideologies, that hamper the integration of research knowledge into policy development. And of course, many researchers feel frustrated when they have to discuss with ministers, when they want to meet the knowledge demands of policymakers, but don't see their research findings used in a proper way. And I understand that frustration. On the other hand, policymakers are also, I will maybe first show this slide and then go back. Policymakers have, even the smartest ones, have a rather negative view of research. If you really speak with ministers, even the ones I worked for, who have been researchers themselves, they see researchers as not willing to step out of their comfort zone, not willing to understand the nature of political challenges or policy challenges, or to take responsibility. Been in so many meetings where researchers said, yeah, but minister, I cannot answer that question, but that's something for the political discussion. But if you give me another couple of millions, maybe we can try to solve that question. How many presentations of research end with a concluding slide, more research is needed? That's not serious. Just stop doing that. Ideology in educational research is very much present. Belief systems on equity, on well-being for the moment, so dominant. And some of the more critical ministers see only researchers pretending to be neutral and objective, but just spreading ideological messages. At least in their perception, that's the case. Researchers are seen by policymakers more interested in their own interests than in the impact of the public interest. But underneath that tension, there are two conflicting rationalities in this game. So the legitimacy and the power of research and the legitimacy of democracy. And these are two very different rationalities. And this slide refers to an old paper by Nathan Kaplan. I don't know whether people will remember that paper. I think it's originally from the 70s, where he speaks about two communities. And he concludes rather in a pessimistic way. He says, well, these two communities will never be able to talk to each other because they have a different language, they have different value systems, reward systems, the behavior is too different, they live in different worlds, they have conflicting concepts, theories of action. So the consequence of Kaplan's theory of the two communities is that only increasing the supply of research evidence and to ask ministers to listen to what research tells them, that's not going to solve the problem. The problem is much more serious. I will now turn to educational practice. Just a couple of recent findings. I think an excellent paper published a couple of years ago already, 2017 in the UK, by our colleagues of EEF and the National Foundation of Educational Research on the use of research by teachers. The conclusion was, very sobering, very, very sobering. Has only a small influence on teachers' decision-making relative to other sources. And teachers were most likely to draw on their own expertise or that of their colleagues when making decisions about teaching and learning or whole school change. It's a really recommended paper if you want to dig into these issues, but it's rather pessimistic. Bob Slavin, the late Bob Slavin, I think you all know him, who has published a lot in his, especially in his blogs, not so much in his scientific papers, but in his blogs. He has discussed the tension between research and teaching a lot. Excellent blogs. He quotes a superintendent in the United States, and I think this is very true for many of our school leaders. Good research is what confirms what I have always believed, and bad research is which I disagree with in what I always believed. I think the heart of the issue here is that in education you have competing knowledge sources. And it is, I don't think it's good practice to say that these other knowledge sources are intrinsically inferior to research knowledge. Well, you all know them. Professional knowledge, where old research evidence is integrated. Tacit knowledge, teachers know best. How many young starting teachers here in the school forget everything you learned in teacher college because here you learn what the job is really about. That's a very strong belief in the teaching profession, that they know best, that their experiential knowledge is the strongest knowledge source to survive in the daily struggle of teaching. We have always done it this way, and it works well. Why should we change? Etc., etc. The research knowledge has to get itself accepted and integrated into this knowledge field in the educational practice. And that's very hard to do. That's extremely hard to do. And it's not a problem of communication or mediation. It's not a problem of producing the kind of convincing evidence. It's a problem of entering to the dialogue and maybe also sometimes the conflict with existing knowledge. Maybe just two examples on the importance of tacit knowledge. And there is a lot more research now on also in other fields on the power of tacit knowledge. This comes from a very important book on this topic, Michael Paolini, The Tacit Dimension. So it's an old book, but for me it's still the best description of tacit knowledge, the ephemeral, elusive form of knowledge that exists, that resists classification or codification, can be gleaned only through immersion in the experience itself. It's not something that can be expressed through language. We can know more than we can tell. That's why it's called tacit. But it's extremely powerful. And the integration into the teaching profession is actually a process of socialization into tacit knowledge. That's what's happening in the early stages when someone becomes a teacher. And it includes forgetting what people have learned in teacher training. It also includes trying to resist arrogant researchers coming to tell you what you should do. I take another example on tacit knowledge from a completely other field of history. Joel Mokyr is, I think, the most famous American economic historian, published a lot of very insight books on the Industrial Revolution. And his latest book is very insightful on the importance of tacit knowledge, and I included here one sentence. What mattered for the Industrial Revolution, and I think it's also true for education, was above all the kind of human capital that was not told at school, but the tacit yet indispensable artisanal competence that was passed through imitation and direct personal contact. That's why I think the job of teaching, you learn it on the floor. You don't learn it in teacher training. It is a kind of personal experience, an immersion, an integration of the tacit knowledge that young teachers, starting teachers, are expected to do. And that process is much more effective than the transmission of research knowledge in the profession. So it is important to recognize that teachers individually and collectively are continuously co-constructing their own knowledge, which guides their professional behavior. That's a very important knowledge dynamics in the profession. It integrates both tacit knowledge, experiential knowledge. It's very powerful, and it's also a positive force. I think researchers are wrong to see, well, there are so many mistakes in the professional knowledge, and that's true. And there are many mistakes in professional knowledge. And so it's a very weak source of knowledge, and we have to transform it by introducing research evidence. That's not going to work. Because it's part of the professional identity of teachers. And you cannot dismiss that professional identity. You can hope only to change it for the better, but you have to respect that professional identity. There are so many examples of teachers resisting educational innovations coming from above, coming from policymakers, but also from researchers, because they conflicted with their experiential knowledge. Good example, inquiry-based learning, or any other topic of social constructivism, which was imposed on teachers. And teachers simply said, I don't believe it. I don't see it working that way in my classroom, in my teaching. And they were right. And they have been dismissed by policymakers and by researchers. And that's part of the crisis where we are in at the moment. I don't think that professional knowledge has a better or a higher explanatory power. It cannot compete with strong, good research, but it has a wider explanatory power for everyday practical challenges. It fills the entire space in education. That's why the pyramid at the layers at the bottom goes wider, because it explains more of daily reality. Research knowledge cannot possibly compete with professional knowledge in explaining and guiding in everyday practice. So it should not be displaced by research evidence, as research evidence should enter into a dialogue with professional knowledge. If we are convinced that a certain intervention or innovation will improve education, we should not say, teachers, stop what you are doing, here's something better, just take it, and everything will be better than before. No. Start a discussion with teachers. Should this work? Will this work? Why do you think it will work? Why do you think it will not work? Etc. I'm quoting a teacher here who recently said to me, after discussing PISA results, the quality of education was much better 30, 40 years ago, when we were not dealing with researchers and other people coming into our schools, telling us what we did for so many years was wrong and that we had to do it differently. And that's a very dominant feeling in the profession. And we have to take that serious. So evidence-informed education is not about filling an empty basket with good evidence, but about entering a complex field of knowledge dynamics. I still do believe, of course, that research evidence is a necessary component of the knowledge infrastructure in education, and it should be an increasingly important component of the knowledge infrastructure. But it's not the only one. It is not necessarily the most actionable one. Teachers are confronted with the situation that they have to make every day very complicated decisions. And what guides that process of decision-making best? It's their professional knowledge. It's not research knowledge. So the dialogue among policy, among knowledge systems is increasingly important. Just a couple of concluding slides. Evidence-informed education is not yet a reality, but the problem is not that we have to mediate, translate the research findings better. I think that process goes well. The problem is with the production side and with the research use side. The authority of educational research is not firmly established, not to the level that we know in the health sector with biomedical research. It is not yet accepted by policymakers and practitioners as a trustworthy source of knowledge. And I think the consequence is that the researchers should abandon trying to impose research evidence on education professionals. I don't want to hear, I'm getting nervous every time I hear someone say, research has shown that. No, that's just a stupid message to give. Research knowledge is not an indisputable truth overruling any other understanding. In the best case, it is a more powerful source of knowledge because of its intrinsic power. So we have to face the reality that various knowledge systems coexist in the education space. It will not change overnight. Hopefully there will be more interaction and dialogue to find the truth and to improve education. In the end, but it will take a long time, research evidence will prevail because it has a higher intrinsic power, but it will take a lot of time. I hope I didn't shock you too much. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Dirk. It was indeed a very critical keynote, a little bit provocative, but I know Dirk for many years, and all his keynotes and speeches have always something, food for thought, and to think about what we are doing, and very critically. Now, I'm more convinced than ever that the word evidence-informed more to this conclusions than evidence-based. It's coming back to the discussion we had yesterday. We have time for one or two questions. I think there will be questions after this presentation, undoubtedly, but who wants to take the floor? Okay, Christophe.
Thank you very much. I'm Christophe de Witte from the University of Leuven. Thank you, Dirk, for this very nice presentation. I was shocked actually on one thing that you said, so I would like to first come with the shock and then with the question. So one thing that you said on the shock was that RCTs are very difficult and often impossible to reach. Within Flanders, we're doing quite a bit of RCTs within parental involvement, differentiation practices, feedback, etc. And one thing that we see is that we need for an RCT to collaborate with schools. We need to collaborate with teachers. So that's basically already creating the bridge between research on the one hand and then teaching schools on the other hand. I think the main issue with RCTs is that often we don't find any effects, and then it's hard to publish them because you do have the publication bias, and as such they don't enter in your overviews because they are not published. Second thing, and that's where I guess this conference might be useful, the long run effects of RCTs are very difficult to find because it's very difficult to combine the pupils that we observe in the RCT with administrative data such that we can follow them over time. So I hope that this conference here might do something about that and combining RCTs, for instance, with administrative data such that you can follow people over time. So that's the shock. The question is also, so you said the two communities of research and policy. It's very difficult to bridge this gap. But of course, as researchers, we do have also incentives. And our incentives within universities is to create top publications and to have good publications. So can you come up with a different incentive system for researchers such that it's more valuable for researchers to discuss with schools, to discuss with policymakers, and not only the focus on the research component itself? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. First on your shock, you know, Christophe, that I admire very much what you are doing and your team, and so I think it's a team which is producing very high quality RCTs, and it's indeed possible to do. But you forgot a couple of words in my statement. It was about the teaching and learning process itself. For me, that it is very difficult to go into the heart of the teaching and learning process with RCTs. That's my doubt. But of course, RCTs are a very powerful research method, and your team is producing some of the excellent examples of that, and we need more RCTs. So the whole idea that RCTs is not to be something that we should strive for, and that the gold standard is imposed on the research community, I don't take that. I think it's a very powerful methodology. The incentives, that's a very good question. I do believe that it should be in the job description of researchers to communicate and to enter into, especially in a field like education or health or welfare, where you have a public responsibility. Being paid with public money makes you also accountable for sharing your results with the public community, whatever that may be. So there should be more incentives. I think the incentive structure, but that's now something which is heavily debated in the research community and the research policy community. The incentive structures for education are skewed. They are skewed towards over-publication. I see with a lot of frustration that the young people have to publish the same paper or variations of a paper in several journals in order to reach the publication records. There is something really wrong in that field. But of course, publication in itself is still the most important incentive for a researcher. But I am very sympathetic to, let's say, an incentive which expresses the public responsibility if you are working in this kind of field. I think we share that idea.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time left for another question because I have to give you some instructions to go to the breakout sessions, and we're running out of time for that. So thank you, Dirk, for the presentation, and warm applause. Yeah. So for the next hour, we will go into a breakout session, the first round, that is until 11:10. After the breakout session, there will be a coffee break for half an hour. Remember that to go into the coffee break room of the conference and to not buy coffee in the shops here in the building. And then we have a second breakout session. Important, yeah, the different rooms are on your marked on your maps like yesterday, and please leave this all from the back entrance, so you're already on the first floor. Important is also that for those who do follow this conference online, that the two breakout sessions that will have live streaming is, the first one is the role of evidence in policy preparation and decision making by Nuno Crato, and then the second breakout session that will be live streamed is fostering partnerships between policymakers and researchers. But it's important to know that after the second breakout session, the live stream will stop because we will then come back to the plenary, and then there will be a cultural interlude, but we are not allowed to broadcast that online. So then the live stream will stop. It's only for people who are here in this room. So enjoy the breakout sessions, and we see each other back at 12 midnight here in this aula.
good morning. Welcome to the session, The Role of Evidence in Policy Preparation and Decision Making. Welcome to all of you here in Brussels, and welcome also to the people who are following online. We start with a presentation by Professor Nuno Crato from Portugal. And we are very pleased to have you here today because you personally bridge the gap between politics and research. According to Dirk van Damme, these are two very different worlds, but you have been in both worlds. You are a professor of mathematics and statistics at the University of Lisbon, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have been Minister of Education in Portugal from 2011 till 2015. And moreover, when you were Minister of Education, Portugal's education outcomes improved. So we are very curious to learn from your experience and from your research on how to improve policies that benefit all students. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Actually, as you said, I've been in both worlds, and I don't believe I have bridged the gap. But and if you attended Dirk's Van Damme's talk, I'm going to repeat many of the things he said because I completely agree with what he said. I believe you are most interested in some type of personal experience. Oh, Dirk is here. I was just saying that I'm going to repeat your talk in a in a less nice way, because you were able to say a couple of things that I would like to say as calmly as you say, but I don't believe I'm able to do that. So I believe you are interested in somehow how do I try to implement research as a minister, and how ministers can try to implement research or to follow research. And we have to be very practical here. We have no time. So when you arrive at the position of minister, either you have very wide knowledge or some knowledge, or you know what you want to do, and you have a team, or you have no time to do it. Because the moment you arrive, you have problems to solve. Education is one of the things in my country, and I believe in most southern countries in Europe, and in almost all countries, is one of the places in which you have problems to solve since the first day. The problems can be ridiculous. I'm going to tell you the first two problems I had to solve. One was someone who came to me and said, Mr. Minister, we have no money to pay next month the grants that we have already distributed formally, but we don't have no money to solve it. That was a big problem. We solved the problem. And the second problem I had was I had to give an authorization for some school in some interior place in the country to have a 15-minute longer lunch break. And of course, the first thing I did with the second one was to revoke the legislation that needed a minister's approval to change the lunch break time of a school. Because, so we have all these type of problems, we have no time. And if you have no idea of what you want to do as a Minister of Education, which is more common than you can imagine, and I have met during the 4 years, 4 months and 8 days of my tenure, I have met many ministers of education in Europe and beyond. It's more common than you imagine that a minister comes and has no idea of what it needs to do. Just be modest and do no harm. That's my recommendation. Just be modest, do no harm, try to manage things slowly, because very soon you are going to meet with hundreds of people who have perfect solutions, who have been working on education for decades, and they know what you have to do, and they just are experts in pleasing the minister and experts in having magic solutions, and every minister likes magic solutions. Would it be digitalization? Would it be learning styles? Would it be something like that? Every minister likes it. So be modest. Now, there is a difference between academics and ministries, obviously. There is a big difference. And that difference rises from many points of view. But I'm just going to give you an example. It's not the best example, but I was thinking during the interval which example I could give. It's this. There is lots of research saying that repetition is not good. There is lots of research for it. For a minister, that's something to be considered, but a minister has to look at the system and has to say, what am I going to do with the system if I have a very centralized system? Am I going to abolish repetition everywhere? Because you tell me that a particular student, when you study a particular student, to repeat a grade is not good. I'm going to be blunt. For a minister, I don't care. For a particular student, I care about the system. And now you come up with lots of research of particular students that have been followed up during ages, up to their up to their active life, adult life, and you come and you say, this is not good for 90% of the cases. And the minister answers, well, possibly, but what happens with the system if I just abolish repetition completely? What happens with the system? Is that a good sign for everybody? Just that we abolish, you may disagree with me, but I'm trying to convince you that there are two different perspectives. And sometimes academics have a local perspective, and sometimes politicians have a broader perspective. This is a good broader perspective to think about the system. There could be a bad global perspective and that's usually is, what can I do just to win the next elections? And that's more common than you can imagine. Now, a difficult thing also for a policymaker is that there are always arguments against something. So, always. You can come up with the most perfect policy. It's backed by research. It seems unbeatable. It seems bulletproof. There is someone who is going to find an argument against it. And that someone usually is someone very vocal, from some special interest, and special interests in education are more common than we think sometimes. So we have to keep considering all these things. So it's not a good perspective. You have talked about PISA and teams, and my country was very fortunate from 2000 up to 2015 to be having better and better results in teams, and people were very pleased with us. Don't repeat the mistake that some people have done with other famous country in education, which is to look at what they were doing when they were already decaying in the decline. Don't look. Look at what they did up to the moment they started decline. And I'm very sorry to tell you, the decline in Portugal started in 2015 because the policy changed. And I don't like to be critical about my own country abroad, but we have to be very careful. Don't take lessons from where you cannot take lessons. If you want to look at my country, and I hope you do, look at what we did up to 2015, when we had an ambitious curriculum, when we had evaluation. Don't look at what happened next, which was to abolish curriculum or to make it more fluid and to eliminate evaluation. So I'm going to, after this thing, the question is this: why is it so hard? And Dirk, you answered everything, so I'm going to repeat it a little bit. Well, first we need to know it, which is not easy sometimes, because you have to browse through journals, you have to talk about experts disagree, and unfortunately in many countries, the academia is not up to date in terms of research in education. Many times, social constructivism or whatever fate happened is still prevailing in some schools of education. So be careful. And you are a minister. Suppose I would be as stupid as to accept a job as Minister of Defense. I know nothing. I didn't even go to the military. So suppose I was so stupid as that. Whom would I trust? The military academy, the experts. And now as a Minister of Education, you have to trust people in education. But people in education disagree, and many schools of education are not up to date into the research, and they still propagate social constructivist views, learning styles, and all these things. So be careful. We have to know the information. Then we need to want it, to want to do it, to want to do something that data is showing you in all those perspectives, from the high-level research, experience, data research, teachers' practice. We need to want to do it. And this goes against many beliefs. And first belief, for instance, is this one: investment is the essential factor for improving education. And a Minister of Education cannot go against this, cannot say, oh no, I'm not going to invest. But has to say, if he or she knows enough about the problem, if has to say, I'm going to invest wisely, not going to put more money in education. In our countries, contrarily to the belief that many people have, we don't need more money for education. Of course, money always helps. If I'm Bill Gates, even if you give me a couple of billion, I don't say no. But money always helps, but that's not a major problem. The problem is how to invest wisely in education. You talk about Brazil, it's a different story. You talk about Mozambique, it's a different story. I was very recently in Mozambique. There are places where the school is a tree. I don't know if you understand this. It's very difficult. You have to see it. It's a tree. And the tree has fixed a couple of things there, and the teacher goes to the tree every morning, and the kids go to the tree. They are around the teacher, and the teacher starts talking how to reading and this type of things, and put some things on a piece of paper, and they have slats, and they write on slats. The students sit on the floor. So, of course, we need more money there. We need more money. But in Europe, we have to invest wisely. Then lower class size. This is another widely spread belief, is that we have to reduce class size. Imagine a minister saying, no, we are going to improve the class size, to enlarge the class size. Well, I actually did that mistake. I increased the class size at secondary by 2 students. It was an uproar. We had Troika, and so we had to comply with a couple of requirements and so on. So it were very difficult times. But during these difficult times, we improved education. And not because we increased class size, but even increasing class size slightly. 2 students in the classroom at high school is not a problem. Then, this is a very widespread belief, is that if you want a demanding education, then lower social economic status students will be harmed. That's very widespread. So we are always balancing this act. Then this is one of the things that I really I'm worried about, is that idea that PISA shows that student-led education is better than teacher-led education. While the data don't read the prefaces of PISA reports. Read the report, read the data. The only time there was a questionnaire about it, it was very clear. Teacher-led education is better than student-led education. Project-based learning doesn't work as well as teacher-led education. It was very clear. The graphs are very clear. People still think this. Then, this is also very harmful. The idea that more important than knowledge is to learn how to get knowledge. People look at that Einstein's quote, if Einstein should be going crazy in his tomb, Einstein said the most important place to know in Princeton is where the library is. And people say, oh, you see, even Einstein was not thinking about knowledge because he knew where to get knowledge. That was the library. Of course, Einstein knew a lot about physics. He had a very good education. That's why he could develop his theory. He knew a lot about mathematics, much more than people nowadays learn when they study physics and they study mathematics as an undergraduate degree. So this is another widespread belief. Other thing is this one. We learn by studying, not by testing. Well, now research helps. Because research shows two things. First, this is not true. Because testing is one of the most efficient ways of learning. Now, this has to be, of course, this has to be discussed, but there is even something called the testing effect. You read a book. You want to learn it better, don't read it again. Because then you create what's called the illusion of knowledge. And that's what every student does, reads and rereads. And as a student rereads a manual, the student gets convinced that he knows or she knows everything. Because I've seen, oh, I know this. Tell a student to go to the back of the chapter, of the back of the book, and try to answer the questions. And that's where the student realizes that doesn't know the topics of the book. So testing helps. Testing, this has been studied. This is a 20th century thing. Well, it started before. And this is another very interesting thing. All teachers knew that testing is good. All teachers know that for ages. That's why they are always asking, John, what is written there? Oh, Mary, why did I say this? They are always asking these things. And they have homework. That's a way of testing. They have homework. They have tests. They have low stakes tests. They have formative tests. All teachers know this. But people sometimes in education say, oh, it's not by testing that we learn, it's by learning. Okay, but testing is a way of learning. But nowadays, we have rigorous studies about this, about the testing effect. It started in 1975, I believe, with a study by Bjork. And then nowadays, we have very systematic studies about this testing effect by Rudiger, Karpike, and other people. So testing is good. Second thing, you are talking about testing, low stakes testing, but you are not talking about high stakes testing. Well, then we have to look at another research, and we have to look at the research that has been done recently, for instance, by Ludger Wassmann from Munich, by Bergenbauer, by Hanushek, in the United States, in Stanford. And they have done the following that was not possible to do in the 20th century. They have looked at PISA data and TIMSS data and international data. And they have looked at the countries and they have seen, when did a country introduce high-stakes testing? What happens next? And the country improved. When did a country abolish high-stakes testing? They look and the country decreased. The position of the country decreased. Okay, this is correlational, but it's a little bit more than correlational. So we should look at this research, being informed, or I don't know what word, but I think that we informed is better than based, because based looks like we are technocrats and we are doing what research tells us. Being informed means keep this in mind. Keep in mind that that there is some research showing this. Now, in your country, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do in Belgium. I don't know what to do in Netherlands. I have no idea. But keep this in mind. Keep in mind that it's not true that we don't learn by testing. We also learn by testing. Oh, this is unabashed propaganda about a book I've written about this thing with a colleague from JRC, from the European Commission. You have here the QR code, so you can take a picture and immediately download the book. The book is open access, so it's propaganda, but not commercial. We discuss these things like RCTs, are they possible? Are they difficult? What's the administrative data? How can we use the administrative data and so on? Okay, so we have these beliefs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about two particular beliefs, which is curriculum and evaluation. So these two beliefs that the demanding curriculum harms students, and the belief that evaluation harms students. It's bad for students. Okay, so curriculum. I firmly believe that the curriculum has to be centered on fundamental subjects. Look at many countries, this is not true. You look at curriculum, and curriculum is centered on everything. And this is, I'd say, this is very serious, because we think that we are in Europe, we are very civilized, and we are very civilized. We are not meeting around a tree, we are meeting in a very nice room. Thanks to the organizers, we are very civilized, but we have about 20% of people with difficulty reading simple sentences. 20% of 15-year students in Europe have difficulty reading. So what are we doing? This is not admissible. In Europe, we have 1/5 of our students with difficulties reading. What are we doing? We are talking about everything, and what about reading? What about basic mathematics? We have also 20% of our 15-year-olds. And if we look at Pearls, for instance, we see that these students started in 4th grade. In 4th grade, they already had trouble in reading. So what are we doing? Why are we not centering our curriculum on this subject? Then the curriculum has to be organized and detailed. Each country is different. There are countries where there are local curriculums. There are countries where the curriculum is set by the school. I think it's very difficult to have curriculum by school, because to write a curriculum is one of the hardest things that people do. You have to have experts in curriculum development, very rare. They are experts in learning styles, but in curriculum development, they are very rare. You have to have experts in subject. We have to have teachers that know how to teach things. We have to have teams, and these teams have to work not in 1 week. That's what usually ministers want, but have to work around 1 year, 2 years. Put it in place. Start with pilot studies. Start with some schools, then enlarge curriculum. So this is a very difficult thing to do. It has to be progressive. Progressive, I mean knowledge begets knowledge, so knowledge over knowledge. We are always talking about this thing about meaningful knowledge, and we forget what David Oswald thought about meaningful knowledge. Meaningful knowledge was knowledge over knowledge. That was knowledge that would enter, and other knowledge in being assimilated with knowledge already existing. So knowledge is very important to assimilate more knowledge. The more we know, the more we can learn. And so this is the only way to long-term retention and assimilation. Structured. And this is another topic. Nowadays, now I'm a little bit outside of science. I'm going to talk about my beliefs. And a little bit informed beliefs, or based beliefs, I don't know. Structured. We have always been discussed this thing, competencies versus knowledge. Of course, we need both things. We need skills and we need knowledge. Of course, we need both things. We need to be a skilled reader, and we need knowledge to understand what we are reading, because if we don't have background knowledge, we don't understand a simple text. When we say a very simple thing, we need knowledge. Oh, we need knowledge. What are we talking about? Is this a game? Is this? We have to know what we are discussing. For a simple sentence, we have to know what we are talking about. So we need knowledge to be able to incorporate more knowledge. Now, skills, we need skills, obviously, but skills don't function without knowledge, without base knowledge. So we have this dilemma. Now, my belief is that there is only one way to structure a curriculum. And so let's move out of this apparent dilemma that we have. We have to do both. We have to be knowledge, and we have to do skills. And let's ask, how are we going to structure the curriculum? Are we going to structure it on skills or on knowledge? And the moment we ask this question, we understand we cannot base it on skills, because there is no structure in skills. The structure for skills comes from knowledge. I have to apply things. A flat tire. I have to be able to solve the problem of a flat tire. I need skills. Okay, sure. But am I going to structure my physics curriculum around flat tires? So today is a flat tire, tomorrow is how to draft a beer, and next day is something else. No, physics is structured in states of matter, solid, liquid, gas, plasma. You state about pressure, what's pressure, what are the laws of pressure, why are the gases compressible, why are fluids not compressible, structured about knowledge. And then we need evaluation. Evaluation, of course, has to be aligned with curriculum. Whatever curriculum we have, it could be a school curriculum, and then you have to have evaluation at the school level, aligned with curriculum of the school. But we need national curricula. It has to be both summative and formative. Don't put things into opposition. We have to have formative testing, and we have to have summative testing. And summative testing and standardized testing, I'm a firm believer in standardized testing, helps formative testing because it helps aligning things at the school level and at teacher level. Then we have to have things standardized, general, local. We have to have everything valid, consistent, comparable. This is very important because some countries don't have comparable. They have standardized testing, but each year they change. And if there is no independent institution doing the testing, and if the testing is doing by the ministry, there is this temptation to show really good results at the end of my term. Results are going to improve during my term as a minister. So we need independent testing because otherwise things are not trustable, frequent. And now the question is that this is so simple. Of course, with some changes in some countries should be one way, other countries a different way. It's so simple, but it's so difficult at the same time. So difficult because we have to convince people, we have to fight against special interests, so it's very difficult. This is a very interesting thing. I don't know if you have been following this SAT discussion. The SAT, some time ago, the top university schools were saying, oh, SAT, standardized testing for university entrance. Oh, this is so bad for students. This is so bad for students. We need to get a more diverse. We can't harm the kids coming from a poor background. We can't harm them. So let's get away with testing. Now, there is something that, if we know a little bit of history, is very paradoxical, is that SAT test was set up in 1929 by the Ivy League schools because they wanted to have a national test that would be valid nationally, and so they could get students from a poorer background, no matter what the background was, that were living in the United States and not in New England, which is the most educated part, or was the most educated part of the United States at the time. So they were introduced with this generous perspective. And then with somehow generous perspective, some schools were removing it. 1 week ago, or 2 weeks ago, MIT reintroduced it. And MIT said, the moment we reintroduced it, we are getting, 4 months ago, time goes flies. So the moment MIT reintroduced it, they said, oh, we are getting a more diverse student body now. We are getting more people from minorities now that we have this standardized test again. The same thing happened in Dartmouth College. So Sean Baylock, I don't know if you know her, is the president of Dartmouth College, or Dartmouth, how you want to say, college, and she is a cognitive scientist. She was elected or nominated president of the school, which is a top school in the United States. And one of the things she did was she created a group to study the admissions test. And after the study was done, and it was a very interesting study. So go to New York Times, see it, but there is a more lengthy report. The moment they did the study, they realized that to rely on interviews and teachers' grades that were provided by schools and by the teachers as for admission was less equitative than to rely on SAT tests. And so they are, again, using SAT tests, standardized testing. Okay, so sorry about this parenthesis, but I was really very, very enthusiastic, very supporting of these things. Now, there is a third part that I didn't talk. So I talked about curriculum, I talked about testing, and the third part is a very absolutely necessary part of this strategy, and that part is support to struggling students. And that's how we solve the problem, or how we try to solve the problem. Because if we lower the standards, the rich kids are always going to private schools with high standards, and the poor kids are going to get the lower standards. But if we raise the standards, they are having more difficulty. So how to solve this? Well, giving special support to students who need it. And now we have a huge body of literature that essentially confirms what my high school and my primary teacher already knew, that tutoring is good, that small groups work is good, and all these things about the support of struggling students. Again, centered on fundamental, timely. We don't do it at 19 when they are exiting high school late time. We should do it immediately, first grade, second grade. If they are having trouble reading, second grade is late to learn how to read. People should learn how to read. At the end of first grade, they should be reasonably fluent readers. So there is an alarm. Why don't we act immediately? Systematic, based on evidence. And here we have lots of evidence. We have lots of evidence about how to learn how to read. But in my country, I don't know about your countries, that evidence, the so-called science of reading, maybe this is a misnomer, but all the evidence that has been accumulating of overwhelming evidence since the 60s, with many studies from Jane Shaw, starting with it, and many others, all the evidence points that there is a way, a science of reading, there is a way of teaching reading that's more effective than others. Many schools of education in my country don't teach this. Many schools of education in many countries I've visited don't teach this. They don't teach the science of reading. They teach entice students to read. How can students develop the love to reading if they don't know how to read? That's the simple question. So first we have to teach them how to read. We have to teach to decode, then fluency, then context, then sentence, then grammar, then background knowledge, and evaluate students' progress. So this is what I believe we have to do. Then we have to make results public. Why public? Because we need to get parents involved. We need to get teachers involved. We have to get everybody to know what's going on in education so that they realize that education is something that is very serious and that in our countries is not in good shape. As granular as possible. That means if we can get it more at the region level, at the school level, I think it's good. And timely, because if we publicize the data from 1 year next year, that's slow. That doesn't change anything. Valid, consistent, comparable, all these things that we know about. There is always a science of teaching, a science of testing in these terms. And make changes, be consequential. Again, so simple. So difficult. So difficult. This is very difficult to do. Because we have all arguments against, we have special interests against, we have many people we are not convinced. Now, second, and the best propaganda, again, it's free to download, so it's not, it's not a commercial. It's just, if you want, I think, there are a couple of things here that are interesting and express more or less what I've been saying. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, oops. Here you have it, and take a picture of it in any way. I have here some slide. I showed it, so I'm going to show. I was preparing it for discussion, but I'm going to show it to you. This is what happened in my country, unfortunately. So these are the latest PISA results. It's up to 2015. We are progressing after 2015. Why? Because from 2003 to 2015, we always pointed it to the same direction. More ambitious curriculum, more evaluation. 2015, we changed course. Look at results. Look at results. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'd be very glad to, whatever time we have left, to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I think you showed that educational policy makes a difference for students. Before we start the questions and answers, I have a question for you. You said that you are a firm believer in standardized testing and that testing should have consequences. So, for example, what is the best consequence for a low-performing school?
Thank you. It depends on the country. It depends on law school. It depends on many things. I believe in a system that we put in place, and it's not novel, it's a system that many countries have in place, is to reward schools that are doing a good job with more resources to do that good job. And so give seed money. It could be seed resources, it could be more teachers, it could be tutoring resources for tutoring. Give school resources as seed resources, and if they do a good job, pursue that and reward with more resources. Something like this. Now, the details are very different from country to country. So you imagine a country that had to wait until 2011 to change the law for the length of lunch break is a very centralized country. It works very different from England, for instance, which is a very decentralized country. But thank you for the question.
Okay. More questions?
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to monopolize the floor, but thank you, Nuno. I agree with most what you said. I have one big question mark, because your experience as a minister and your reflections afterwards and your publications, etc., which I always read with a lot of interest, are coming from a country which is rather centralized in education. So it's state heavy. It has a high degree of centralization, a lot of power to the minister and the ministry. That's completely different in this system or in the Netherlands or in other systems which have much more pluralism, freedom of education, diversity of approaches of schools, etc., etc. So the thing that I sometimes dispute when I read your stuff is, do you really want this education system in a very diverse society, in a pluralist society, to stay that centralist? Is centralism, in your view, a precondition for effective policy making? My view is much more diversity in itself is good, also in education, as long as you have powerful accountability systems. I agree completely with standardized testing, etc., etc. But the input side should not be that centralized, even not at the curriculum level. So for me, and this is a very delicate discussion in Flanders, in the Netherlands, and a couple of other countries, because what's the power, to which level should the power of the state go? What is the level of variation that schools and school networks can bring into the curriculum? That's a shifting power struggle, an endless power game going on. But I think in the end, it has more advantages than a very centralized system. And So that's my only remark on your contribution to the discussion, that it is coming and still staying in a policy context which is very, very centralized.
Maybe I'll move here so that we don't have to be always, or can I take this over there? It seems it's portable. Okay, thank you. I don't know if I'm disrupting the system here. My simple answer is I completely agree with you. But the situation is that my country, Spain, Italy, France, Greece, Greece I'm not so sure, they are very centralized. And anything you want to do to move away from that has lots of resistance. My most difficult moment in my mandate, I'm sorry, I just drank water in the wrong way. It went to the wrong place. So I completely agree with you. I believe that even curriculum, but so my point is that we have to have a clear curriculum, well-structured, structured around main subjects, structured around knowledge. That's my main point. You can have it at the school level, you can have it at the regional level, you can have it at the national level. In my country, it has to be national level at this moment. The most difficult moment in my mandate was when I tried to move a little bit away from it. We have such a centralized system that teachers are placed with by a central computer. So teachers can be placed all around the country. You are from Lisbon, you apply, and the job you get is in Porto, and you can be placed in Porto, which is 300 kilometers. For a small country like us, this is an infinite distance. So you have that. That was, I tried to change a little bit this was most difficult moment in my mandate. Called to the parliament twice, uproar in the country. My house was circled for twice by the unions. So circled at night, because I wanted to move 1% of the teachers to be assigned, contracted at school level. Everybody was against it. And this is one of the things that in our countries now is very serious, is that this is very politicized. It's very political. This is very politicized. This is very political. So if you have an opposition, the opposition is very radical, as it is now, because our countries are very polarized. They are against you, like, I'm against. What did you say? Oh yeah, I'm against. Of course I'm against. The most incredible thing is this. There was an admission test for teachers, which was very low, but it was a test for teachers that was introduced by the previous government from a different party. They introduced the test, they legislated, they didn't put it in place. When I put it in place, they were against it. The party that legislated it was against it the moment we introduced the test. Why? Because it was the unions that were against it. So the unions are very powerful. So in my country, I don't know about yours, but they are very powerful and very politicized. So there are special interests everywhere. Long answer for a very simple question, but I agree what you are saying. I completely agree. So if you move away from a centralized system, I think it's better.
Hi, thanks for your interesting presentation. My name is Inge de Wolf. I'm a professor of education from the Netherlands. My question is about maybe another instrument, and I just want to know whether you have experience as a minister or maybe as a scientist with that. It's about the initial teacher training programs. So how important, in addition to curriculum and testing and all the things you said, how important are the initial teacher training programs? And is it also an instrument for the government to kind of promote evidence-informed education in a country?
Oh, thank you for this question. This is very important. Initial training is very important. And it's more important than professional development, I believe. Because if you learn what you are going to teach when you are 18, up to 22, that's 24, you learn it much better than if you are restarting as a teacher to learn it. So professional development should be, it's important, but on the basis of already a knowledgeable teaching body. So I think it's a very important thing, and I'm very sad that in many countries the teacher initial training is not as rigorous as it should be, and it's not centered on where it should be centered. And in my firm belief, again, there is some research supporting this, but its belief is that first, teachers have to know the subject they are going to teach. So if you don't know math, you cannot teach math. If you don't know physics, you cannot teach physics, and so on. Second, you have to be updated on the on cognitive psychology, on learning and so on, how we learn, and that's very surprising also, because if you the basics of learning, how we learn, what's short-term memory, what's long-term memory, what's cognitive load, these basic things are not taught in many schools of education, which is very sad, because these are basic things for a teacher to know. And then practice, third thing, practice and supervised practice. I think that's very important. And I appreciated very much what you said, Dirk, about the teacher culture, and I think it's a very important thing. And in a way, it's very fortunate that with all these fads that people coming saying, oh, it's not this way, it's that way, and oh, now we have learning styles, now we have, I don't know, those who have been here for a long time know so many different last-term solutions, fantastic solutions that appeared. It's good that teachers have some resistance in terms of incorporating these things into their practice. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. One of the things you said, of the reasons why Portugal is declining again in the PISA tests, was that they abandoned evaluation, if I heard well. And can you elaborate some more on that? Because what is now came in place of evaluation, and how was it organized before that, and how is it organized now? And what has been the impact of that change in education there?
Thank you. Well, we had a system with standardized testing at the end of each school cycle. And this is very important. This was not a low stakes, not a high stakes, was a medium stakes, I would say, a medium stakes system, because almost no one would fail because of the standardized testing, almost no one, except if they had failed 2 standardized tests, plus they had failed previously in school in 3 subject areas. So it was like last resource cases, but they had a powerful incentive effect. And at the end of each school, they are abandoned, and only in this moment, at the end of 9th grade, there is testing in only 2 subjects, and it's not consistent, not valid. So it's not made same style, the same every year, so it's not comparable. We don't know what to expect. And this comes in parallel with a more fluidity in the curriculum, because if the curriculum is more fluid and more vague, then we don't know exactly what's going to be there. So what's there is like a minimum, a bare minimum on the standardized testing. Then there is a debate nowadays about abandoning the high school exit tests and replacing them only by entrance exams into the university. I think it's a mistake also. Unfortunately, things are on hold now regarding that change. So essentially it's this. So valid test, it means comparable, done by an independent authority, and setting the tone for all the other evaluations at the end of each school cycle. Now, there is a different thing, which is in the middle of the school cycle, there is a standardized testing that varies in difficulty, varies in topic, varies in everything, so it's absolutely useless, or almost useless. I say I'm not against to have standardized testing, just formative or just informative, low stakes in the middle of a school cycle, no problem, but we have to have at the end of school cycles, because the curriculum is structured in cycles. So at the end of 4th grade, for instance, or 6th grade, you have to know this, this, and that. And if you do it in the middle, some schools are ahead, some schools are not, and rightly so. I don't know, too long an answer for a very important question. Thank you. If you don't have questions, I can either we stop or I can tell a couple of stories.
I maybe have another question. So, you've shown rather common misconceptions, false beliefs. They are widespread, but how do we conquer them? And do you have any suggestions on how to conquer these misconceptions?
Well, thank you. Well, this is one of the places in which, or one of the topics, I think it's a very important question, because this is one of the topics in which I believe that research is really helpful. So, for instance, everybody, 98% of teachers in a recent poll that I've seen, or 96, I don't remember, but about that thing, believed in learning styles. Okay. Everybody believed in learning styles, or many believed. This is one of the places in which the brokers, the research and the brokers can be very useful, because they can say, this is not true. And if you are a teacher, you see a professor of cognitive sciences at a reputed university saying learning styles is not true, you stop and say, maybe let me explore things a little bit better. So this is a role we have to have. And I've seen many academics that believe that learning styles are not good, and they are afraid of saying it. They should not be afraid. They should say, this is not proven. This is not work, doesn't work, and so on. What's the problem of it? The problem, of course, if we go to a country like the United States or some other countries, the problem is that then they sell special kits for testing the learning style of students and all these type of things. That's a problem. If you are in a country such as mine, we don't have these things, but it disorganizes the teaching profession, because the teacher starts believing that, oh, you need a graph and he needs some auditory thing. And then a teacher, which by intuition, when teaches music, of course, has to sound something. When it teaches geometry, has to make a picture. And when they teach algebra, has to talk about symbols. So is not, if he has learning styles, saying, oh, maybe I should teach algebra with music or with kinesthetic thing. Oh, it's crap, of course. But so it tends to disorganize the teaching profession. I think that's the point.
Do you think sometimes these beliefs are so rooted in who they are as a teacher? Do you believe that just giving the information by a well-known researcher is enough to change someone's belief? Maybe some people are research resistant. Also, what's not helping is that sometimes experts say different things. You have one expert saying, oh, learning styles are rubbish, while another expert will say, oh, but no, this is very important to take into account. And then the teacher doesn't know who to trust.
Well, certainly this is a problem. Certainly this is a problem. That's one of the reasons where I believe that the experts, the people who really know these things, should speak freely and should say, no, this is not true. Sorry, this is not true. Or sometimes they can put things in a mild way. I'm a little bit blunt, but someone as Dirk could be more polite and could say, well, there may exist some learning preferences by students, but there is no research showing that catering to students' preferences is good for their progression. You can say things in a more polite way. I'm sorry to to put you on the spot, but
I'm just reflecting that learning styles today is a very easy example. Probably 15 years ago, it was much more difficult, and because it takes time to falsify a theory. And take a more recent example like growth mindset. In the book of Carol Dweck, if you read it, it's very convincing. There is good research behind it. It is an interesting concept. It coincides with the whole idea of high expectations and ambitions and reinforcing students, etc., etc. So, but now we see publications that maybe not the concept is wrong, but the interventions are wrong. So growth mindset interventions prove not to work. There are too many papers now falsifying the whole idea that you can develop growth mindset. But yeah, there is a time lag between the publication of Carol Dweck's book, which I don't know, I don't remember, 2015 or something like that, and today. So it takes a lot of time. It's not only that you need the right researchers to tell the truth. It's just the fact that truth is showing itself in mysterious ways and after a lot of time. And I'm more concerned about why is the education sector so, can it be so seduced by new concepts, new fashions, new ideas, etc. And it's as if the education sector is looking for the next big thing, where other sectors are more easily developing. Sound research is taking time. There are falsifications in biomedical research, of course, but it's not that system where people are longing for the next big solution. That would be my reflection.
No, I completely agree. People are, well, two things that you said, I think they are important. First thing is that research takes time and people are seduced, right? So research takes time. Even the Mozart effect, for instance, I think it's a good example. I don't know if you are aware of this idea, because 10 years ago or 20 years ago was a big thing. Someone made an experiment. What's her name? I don't remember her name. Someone did an experiment with music, playing music to kids, and then giving a task in special recognition. So, you know, and after listening to Mozart, a particular thing in Mozart, students were doing better. Okay, and she published it in a very thing, and then it appeared in Nature, and it was like, because people are looking for these fantastic things, and in some places, I think it was the governor of Kansas, or even gave CDs to all newborn kids, Mozart CDs, because it would be nice and so on. And the point is that the researcher who did this, I don't remember her name, but if you go to Wikipedia, Mozart effect, you find it in 1 second. This is one thing in which, but you have to know what you are looking for. So, and even she came up at New York Times and said, this is wrong, I never said that. I recognize that was this small effect, and other type of music could be, and other type of enticement is good. Plus, the thing that people don't quote about my research is that it was a short-term effect. So it was like 5 minutes or 10 minutes after listening to Mozart, you are better. And she never tried it with jazz, or she never tried it with gymnastics or something that could be, to see what happened. So she came public twice on New York Times saying, this is bullshit, this is not what I said. And even people still today, some people believe in Mozart, so it's very difficult. It's very difficult. People like the next things. That's why one of the reasons I liked very much your presentation yesterday, or the way you started, is that situation is serious. Come on, we are talking about Mozart effect, but there are 1/5 of students in our countries don't read. This is very serious. Stop talking about Mozart effect and about all these things, and pay attention to this very serious situation. Okay.
Can I give you another example?
Someone. Thank you. Sorry, I'm speaking too much.
I've got a question for Nuno Krato because you're both researcher and a policymaker. I've got a general question because of the question of Bieke. Should we conquer as researcher the false beliefs? But I've got a general question. Is value-free research, is it possible or not? Or can't we desire this, yes or no? It's a very general question, I know, because you mentioned false beliefs. I think you mentioned 5 or 6 once. And my question is, do you have to conquer this?
I think we should counter false beliefs. I think we should counter. I think research in itself is not valued, is not value, it's not value driven. Research is more pure than that. The value comes from what people use the research to, because people can use this, think about the Mozart effect as giving CDs to students, or they could use it as, this is interesting, maybe that's a good topic. Do you know who Mozart was? Have you ever listened to Mozart and put it in a classroom? And this is a good way to put things. So, and maybe listen to a little bit of music. Maybe you would be enthused and you would listen to a little bit of music at home and discuss things after it. I don't know if I gave a direct answer to your question. Just start.
I think we can have the discussion over a coffee. So now we have half an hour of coffee break downstairs, and then you have another breakout session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
host for today is Annette Boas. You've heard her keynote yesterday, so you know that she's a professor of health and social care at King's College in London, and that she is an expert when it comes to bringing evidence into policy, and she will guide us today on how to foster partnerships.
Thank you. So I thought everybody might be getting a bit tired by now, a bit full of information. No? Excellent. So I am going to talk a little bit, but the main part of the session we're going to talk together. Even though the room is not designed for that, we're going to still make it work. But what I wanted to start off by doing is asking you, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to share some experiences. We're going to have a short break where we move into spaces in the room that are going to work to discuss in sort of groups. And then we're going to address some of the questions that hopefully will come up through the presentation. But what I wanted you to do to start with is share some of your experiences of working with researchers, with policymakers, with practitioners, with other stakeholders beyond your work, but around research. So what relationships have you had, and what experience has that been for you of connecting with people doing other types of roles kind of relevant to your work? If you don't have any experience of that, you can think about what it means to kind of work in partnership around other elements of your work as well. I'd just like you to just talk in pairs a bit about those experiences, just to kind of warm us up for what we're going to discuss today. And I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to do that. For people who are joining online, if you could do the same, if you could spend 5 minutes reflecting on experiences you've had of kind of working in partnership with either researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and just share a bit with each other. Thank you.
Schedule to
Yeah.
transfer people
Yeah.
into the next room.
Yeah. So I don't want to stop you talking, and we will definitely pick up this conversation in a minute. But I just wanted to share a few thoughts about partnerships to feed into our discussion. So I guess the first issue for me is that we have traditionally thought in terms of a hierarchy of working in partnerships, so that there's one super perfect way of doing it at the top of a hierarchy that is kind of empowering and close collaboration. But I very much prefer this approach from Canada, which argues that actually these really sit on a continuum and none of them are better than others. And sometimes you are genuinely just informing people about things that you have to do. And at other times there is scope to be much more engaged and empowering in the work you do. But it's about picking the right approach to working with our partners for the scope there is for them to be involved, the time we've got to do it, and the kind of impetus there is and appetite there is for working together. I think this kind of spectrum of thinking about approaches to participation just helps us, gives us permission to sometimes just consult and sometimes just inform, but to do other more collaborative things when we have opportunities. So the only thing I really wanted to share with you is some work we did based on a literature review, which was to think about what the kind of best practices are in the literature for working in a partnership. And these are a set of 15 design principles, and we've organized them into kind of organizational values and kind of practices. And I'm just going to run through them with a few examples. And a lot of them are really, really obvious, but and they're practices we do in our professional work, but we often don't bring them into our partnerships. And so our partnership working can be very ad hoc compared to our other professional working. So many of these things are things that we do anyway in other parts of our work. And I guess the argument in the literature is that it really helps if we also bring them into the work we do with our stakeholders. So the first one, and the one we do least often, is to be very clear why we're working with our stakeholders, what the objectives are for bringing people into our processes or engaging with outside research teams and other partners. Why are we doing it? What is it for? And if we articulate that, things tend to run a lot better than the usual experiences where everyone's sitting around the table and no one really knows why they're there. And they might do that for many years. So being clear about objectives is really important. It's also really critical to be thinking about stakeholder engagement as part of a wider framework for thinking about research use. So if you want teachers to use research, then thinking of a way of engaging them there's a very powerful message in the literature there that says the earlier and we involve people in the process, the earlier we bring them in, the more likely it is at the end of the day that they'll feel it's something that they can use. So that idea of kind of building it into how we think about research use, kind of early engagement leading to potential that people will actually use the work we do, that kind of framing is really useful. This is resource-intensive work. Much of the resource is time. But when we work with our professional stakeholders and we're asking them to come and join us in projects, it's really good to have thought about what it is that makes that a nice experience. Often coming and doing work in a partnership is an additional task people have to do on top of their day jobs. So making sure they have a really nice lunch and that they're looked after and they're in a comfortable environment can really make a difference to how a partnership fires and runs. So that idea of kind of resourcing, which is very different for different types of stakeholder, is really critical. When we're bringing people with lived experience into partnerships, there are whole other issues about actually how we pay for the time that they're giving us to participate as well. Putting in place kind of opportunities for awards. We talked a bit about this yesterday, but actually often people aren't rewarded for participating in things like partnerships. And we can reward people for it. We can work it into how we kind of appraise our staff and think about the work they do, something that they actually would talk about when they're reflecting on their practice. So this idea of actually rewarding this kind of activity, this helps to ameliorate for the fact that what tends to happen is the people who like doing this kind of work do it, whereas if you build it more into incentives, then you get a wider range of people who are keen to engage. And then the last one is recognizing that some stakeholders actually play key roles in projects. When you've worked with stakeholders in other work, I'm sure you'll have come across this, but sometimes you realize that you've stumbled across someone who can be really core to the work that you do and becomes much more than kind of a partner in a partnership project, but a kind of key collaborator that you work with over a long period of time. And similarly, some people kind of duck in and out of partnerships. So they might be with you sometimes and they might not be at other times. And making space for that can be really important. We did a piece of work once where we mapped where the stakeholders had come and joined us in the partnership and found that some people had been very involved at the start but didn't want to stay involved. They wanted to be helping to get things going and set up, but they really didn't want to stay involved for a long time. Some people were keen to help join at the end to get some action going, and some people were with us for the whole time. But that idea that actually not everybody has to be in a partnership all the time, turning up to every meeting and to seeing actually the different contributions, different kind of stakeholders can bring to a partnership was really important. So the second set are around values and the values that underpin working in more collaborative ways. The first is kind of just having that conversation really about what the shared values are that underpin work we do together. So sitting down and talking about those values and some of those value differences. And I think one of the best partnerships I ever worked on, we sat around at the start and accidentally someone started a conversation about values. And it turned out that some of us had very kind of mechanistic views of the world and some of us were chaos thinkers. And as we went around talking about it, we didn't mean that we were all the same, but the way we worked together was very different because we'd had that conversation at the start about how we saw the world and how we saw the work that we were doing within it. And it was a sort of unintentionally honest start that somebody did as they introduced themselves, and that just set up a completely different partnership. So that idea, as we talked about yesterday and has come up a number of times, values are really important to getting work done. And so surfacing them can be helpful for a partnership. And it doesn't mean that they necessarily always have to be shared. Sometimes you've got some differences that come in, but at least having the conversation. Sharing and understanding that actually stakeholder engagement is about more than individuals. So normally when we're identifying people we want to work with in a partnership, we're thinking about organizations, and then we get the individuals and we become great collaborators with them. But actually, the reason we brought them in was to do with the organization they work in. And so revisiting when people move on from their jobs, that do we still keep that person, or do we actually still need someone from that original organization, is really critical. And to get those stakeholders to actually go back into their organizations and talk about the work they do on the partnership is really kind of important to making sure their organization continues to support the work that they're doing with you, but also that they go away and make connections with the which is often why you've brought them in to start with. The number 9 is about attention. This actually came from the paper, so it's written in an unnecessarily complicated way. Attention between productivity and inclusion means partnership working can slow you down, and it can slow you down a lot. And so building that into our programs of work can be really important to make the time to grow a partnership, to engage with each other, to understand the different places we're coming from. If we don't have space to do that and space to kind of flex in the process, it can really be challenging. We had a project funded by the EU where we were looking at rolling out a program of work, and we had a hard deadline with the funding. It had to be spent by a certain point, and big delays in the project that meant the work we wanted to do with stakeholders, which was going to be really collaborative, we were going to be together in person, we were going to spend lots of time together, ended up as a few kind of very short online sessions. No relationships were built, no real engagement. We were ticking off a box because we knew we had to get the work done by a certain date. If we did that project again, I think we'd be thinking differently about leaving some space in the project to make sure we could work with our stakeholders. And generating a shared idea that we might want to work together, have these kind of continuous relationships that underpin our work. And the number of times with research policy engagement that you're actually using a kind of engagement that you started 10 years ago, or somebody had a connection in the past, because it's a long time often from when we start a piece of research work to it being truly useful in a policy context. So we're often talking about building relationships for the long term. And then the last set are around practices, the how-to of kind of working with stakeholders and doing partnership work. The first is about having a plan. So planning out how we work with our stakeholders, how we connect with them, how they connect into research programs. It sounds obvious. Normally people don't have one. So they haven't thought, well, how is it that I'm going to connect with these stakeholders during the course of the project? How are we going to work together? What's it going to look like? Who's going to be the person who kind of has the leadership roles and all those kind of elements of planning? Building flexibility in for when things go wrong, because they definitely do go wrong in partnerships. You lose people, you lose momentum. And considering how input from stakeholders can be gathered a bit more systematically. So typically, we're just really relieved people have turned up to be part of a partnership, but actually how do we capture the input they're giving to us? And probably more significantly and more often missing, how do we use that input people have given us? So how do we kind of collate it? How do we analyze it? And how do we employ it to make sure the work is done in a better way? Again, all these things are really obvious, and they're things we do in our day-to-day work, but they're things we often completely lose sight of when we get into a partnership context. And sort of also recognizing that we're going to be revisiting throughout the process who the important stakeholders are. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes this is because our stakeholders move on. But the other thing that happens with partnerships is the partnership goes in a different direction. And so we're thinking about bringing in new people to engage with work that weren't the people we were thinking about when we started a piece of work. Most bits of research in particular end up in a very different place to where they start. And you need to be thinking about kind of different stakeholders. And this morning we already talked about dark sides. People love putting dark sides in their papers. It's all their Star Wars stuff, stays with us forever. This is a paper on the dark side of partnership working, which is really interesting, I think, and caused all kinds of problems. People hate this paper, but I think it raises some really challenging issues about actually what it feels like sometimes to be in a partnership, how used people can feel, particularly from a policy perspective and a practice perspective. They get sucked in so somebody can say that they've had a partner. Analysts in government are brought in and told that they're the policy partner, even though they don't have policy roles. So there's all kinds of things that can happen in partnerships that are uncomfortable. Often we're in a space where our lines of accountability and transparency are not there. So how is it that we work together and in a kind of comfortable shared space? And so I'm going to ask you to have a think about this in a minute. So we're going to divide up. We might even stand up. We might stand up because I'm not sure how it's going to work sitting down. And just spend a bit of time thinking about some of these questions. As a little group, you can just pick one of them to have a think about. So you might want to think about that dark side. We heard a lot about dark sides this morning, and there might be some things that you could think about in a partnership context. Or you might want to think about actually how do we know if a partnership is successful, a research partnership. You might have insights from other partnerships you've worked in that help you think about that. You might want to think about what you think the key roles that might happen in a partnership between research and policy. What are the kind of key things that you need to make that work? And we might want to think about, well, actually, why are we doing this? What are the advantages to working in partnership? Given that it's going to slow us down, it might cost a bit more, and people aren't going to get rewarded very well for doing it. So you're free to decide what you'd like to talk about, whether you want to work through them, whether you want to pick one. I'm going to suggest completely mixing up. So just go and find a little huddle of 4 or 5 people, have a little chat. And then what we will do is we'll come back together, and if each little group could share kind of one insight from their groups that we can share with the people online, that would be great. And then we'll be done and off for our mysterious session in the main room. If we're not in there on time, we're locked out. Yes. So which means we'll be locked in, which is more scary. So if you could sort of there's lots of space around the room, find an area, 4 or 5 people together. And we don't have very long, so it's probably going to be about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back together, wrap up, and go and get locked in the main room. Okay, so it would be really lovely to hear a few of the things you've been discussing. We just have about 10 minutes. So if anybody from any of the groups would like to share some like little flavor of the discussion, that would be great. We have a roving microphone. That's you, the roving microphone. Okay, can you get to that? Oh, this is gonna be a challenge, isn't it? You might, it's just in case there's anyone online. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
We talked about some of the really good questions, but we also talked about partnership in general and our experiences of it. And so we did look at dark side of partnerships a little, and from experience, I suppose, sometimes involving partners who don't necessarily share motivation for the question or for the policy area. And we talked about one experience that one of us had who, you know, where I suppose it was being driven maybe by the ministry and the research, and the practitioners that were involved didn't maybe share the motivation for that was a good question. We're also talking about we talked about practitioners quite a lot, and I suppose the really important need to get practitioners involved, but then getting the right practitioners involved and the spectrum of views. And sometimes, you know, when practitioners are invited by ministries into a project like this, it's the representative groups who hold a particular viewpoint, not necessarily a viewpoint that represents the spectrum of views within their membership body. So I think that was another kind of is a dark element that we felt that sometimes can actually derail good kind of work in this kind of group, but and really bring perspectives that aren't necessarily the spectrum of perspectives from practitioners. And I think that's a real challenge. And then I suppose we came back to time, and you know, facilitating the time and trying to have, I suppose, one of the difficulties with teachers and the education sector is time. There isn't an equity with the researchers and the policymakers who have in their jobs time built in to conduct this project. You know, in many instances, we're maybe asking teachers to do something on top of their other work, on top of their daily work. They may not be getting release time for it. If they are getting release time for it, that's sometimes very challenging from a school management perspective to actually get the cover at the moment. And then it becomes challenging kind of from the financial perspective for governments and for ministries to facilitate that. So we maybe haven't we've maybe ended up in kind of some of the negative aspects of.
But you've discussed some really interesting things. I think that issue about, in terms of things like time, which of the partners' ways of working set how the partnership works. So we're currently doing a project where we're working with people with kind of lived experience of social work, and the person we're working with, she always wants to meet in person. She likes being in person, and we really like working as efficiently as possible, so we want to do it. But if we're going to work with her, we need to work in person. So that thinking about what your different partners want in terms of, so the working practices is important. That issue of motivation is very strong in the literature on partnerships, so that actually sometimes it's suggested that you actually map your stakeholders, so you decide who to work with based on how motivated they are, because it's such a difficult thing to generate if people don't have it. So they almost suggest that you find the people who are kind of powerful and motivated, and you focus there. Obviously, power is a difficult concept, because often we want to work with people who don't have as much power but are going to be using the work down the line. So a really interesting discussion. Thank you. Any of the other groups?
Maybe. First of all, don't be afraid, I'm not going to start with Darth Vader as a first when we talk about the dark side. First of all, thank you to my team. We were strongly focusing on the first question, and of course then on the fourth question, potential advantages. Well, from our point of view, it's a big chance actually when you are able to include a lot of stakeholders into the definition and the concept and of research and a research project, then you can get a broader perspective and also a broader outcome. But it also was very important to us to see that maybe in the beginning, in advance, we are maybe able a little bit more to also define or maybe predict risks regarding the process of the research, regarding the outcome, and also about the facts, for instance, what will others who are in charge do with the results of the research, nevertheless, what the research outcome is. And of course, also it's about defining quite clearly the roles of the partners, which is also something which in advance needs to be addressed, and also taking into account maybe the background of the people. When you have a broader basis, they come from institutions, they come from stakeholders, for instance, trade unions, economy, industry. Of course, they have a common interest, which is okay, that's their job. And then I switch to the question number 4, it's the issue of the dark side, because the one risk, of course, is you have some research, you do some research, you have some results, and probably those who are in charge of the political decisions on basis of this research say, okay, in half a year I do have elections. What shall I do with the results? Shall I implement it right now? I want to be re-elected. So that's the kind of discrepancy and the problem that is. And of course, also during the process, a broader perspective, a broader basis of partners in the research project is quite vital. But you also have maybe, then you come to the dark side or maybe to the risk, that based on the background and the position, they maybe are forced to withdraw a little bit from the research project. So keeping them in the loop all the time and maybe addressing all of these concerns is also something that needs maybe a lot of work during the process of research. But when you try to be as broad as possible in the beginning and try to define as good as possible maybe risks, then the outcome will be better.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think one of my colleagues who runs a lot of big evaluations for government, he says that he sees the process as deeply collaborative, and then you go into a tunnel where you try and actually, as a research team, carry on doing the work with some integrity, and then you come out of that tunnel and you're ready to engage again. But he finds that kind of model really useful to be thinking, well, there's a part of this process where we need some distance, and everybody knows what's happening and when you go into that tunnel and when you're going to come out again. And so I hadn't ever really thought about it like that, but I think that does help with some of the things you've mentioned around, particularly researchers being very concerned about early findings being used before when they're still tentative and they haven't, for example, collected all the data or analysed their data. So yeah, it's a really interesting interplay between the advantages and the dark side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for my team for reminding me of the things I'm going to forget. But we had started with the first question actually. First, we had an example from it was from my memory actually. The National Geographic Channel had a brain games show, and they showed an example where 50 people had to guess how many toys, the same kind of toys, were in a bowl, and they were just shooting out of blue. But then when the average was computed, the number was actually very, very close to the actual number. So one person may not have the answer, but collaboration can get closer to the answer. And that for me, as a statistician basically, is a very good example to remind me how it's important when I'm being stuck with people, or becomes very difficult working with people, why it is still important to go on, to really try to go on. And then we had a point that a trust is, again, the necessary starting point for building partnerships, but then also a consequence. When we build partnerships, we also, together with it, build trust, that we get to know each other, we understand each other's worlds. And then we had an example that perhaps again we were lured to the dark side, that there are, for example, policymakers that use the same experts for finding expert support for their political ideas, which is, of course, the not very good thing to do, again, because these ideas need to be changed. Well, partnerships need to be built in a way that open up out-of-the-box thinking, because more of the same might not lead to the good thing. There was a lot more, but I'm sorry. Maybe somebody else would like to bring in? Okay, thank you.
5 minutes. And that, I mean, that's a great point about also focusing on what the real advantages that can come out of partnerships, so that the thinking that you get from bringing people who see a field in different ways. One of the things that really struck me years ago about the kind of education literature, when people started doing research on people's attitudes and what they wanted to know about, there was an almost entire misfit between the research that had been being conducted and what people who were in the education system wanted to know about. Almost no overlap. And so if we don't have these spaces to think and engage, then there's a danger that we just won't be doing the most useful work for the sector. Definitely. Anyone like the final word over this side of the room? No pressure? Anybody?
Okay, so I stand. I think it's a very pressure to have the final word. But for our group, we were all in research policy, combining as research history with the policy work, policy officer work, or I do knowledge sharing, funding organization type of work. And so we were actually potential partner in ourselves, in our own group. And we were thinking, okay, maybe it's not that big a deal because we can just join and talk it to each other and we'll be fine. But actually in our own backgrounds, we noticed actually the dark side. A lot of difficulties with making researchers or making challenging, stimulating, and making enthusiastic researchers and policy officers together, because of all the things that you just said. But maybe it's also a cultural thing. Like the researchers in the Netherlands, for example, but also in other countries, they like to do, they know that it's community money, they know it's taxpayers' money, so they have to give back. They're happy to give back to the practice, but not to the policy makers. So that's a big step. And even in the country like the Netherlands, where we are a democratic, open culture, tolerant type of country, it's very, very difficult to get these two different fields actually working together. Maybe for half a year it will be fine, but after that it's gone. So there's a lot to do, so keep up the good work would be.
Yes, we'll keep at it.
Talk.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating, for standing up, and for bringing some energy into the room. Very much appreciated. We are under strict instructions to get back in the room. You have 6 minutes to get between here and there. I'm not going to suggest there's time to go anywhere else. 6 minutes, and then it's too late. So thank you.